All right, here we go, y'all. Part 2.
Are the stars out tonight? I don't know if it's cloudy or bright.
All right, babe. So hopping back in here to this podcast from the Hard Men podcast by Eric Kahn. Why? And actually, I didn't say the title last time, but I think it's apt. It says, "Why Pietism is Destroying America." Strong title there. But I think this is going to be good. We're just going to keep going from where you left off last time. Here we go.
That concept at its very root is fundamentally flawed.
Yeah.
I don't believe that's what God is doing in the world. God called man, according to Genesis 1, to exercise godly dominion in the earth under his authority and to bring glory to him in all that we do. Every aspect of creation and culture should be bringing glory to God. And that salvation is a restoration of sinful man to that calling. Now, that's very different from the evangelical paradigm that I just described a couple minutes ago.
Yeah, it's hugely different. And I think one of the ways you see that is, I mean, I'm continually shocked. Mark Dever was another one that had said this recently, but just saying, no, heavens no, I don't want to see culture transformed. And it really is only about what's happening in the church. But even that, it seems like you really have to cut things off, because when you start looking, okay, if it is about the church, well, what does the church do? It makes disciples. What's discipleship for? Going out and changing the world. Now we have a problem. So I'm just curious where you think this anti-culture transformation comes from. Is that also just a direct one-to-one to pietism, or is there more going on there?
That's a good question. I can't remember what he says.
I don't either, but
here we go. Well, listen, we'll see what he says.
I think pietism is one of the main factors. I think in the United States and Britain, another is the theological paradigm known as dispensationalism, which was also pietistic in its own way, though it was sort of had a separate origin and stream.
So that's a whole nother podcast or two, maybe 3. But dispensationalism, which it just means like age or era, I think, basically I think it got really popular. There are different versions of it, but got really popular coming off the John Nelson Darby, Plymouth Brethren kind of thing, spread across the U.S., especially through the revivals. D.L. Moody, lots of folks became dispensationalists, and that was the whole like different eras of like God deals with his people different ways in different time periods, and it was very much rapture theology, premillennialism, but even more specific than that. And right now we're in the church age and this kind of thing. So typically it tends to be a more pessimistic view of the future. Like things are just going to get worse and worse and worse. Finally, Jesus will have kind of rapture the church out. And then you have the final, the 7 years of really, really bad tribulation. And then he comes back and, rules for 1,000 years on earth before the final judgment. That's, really quick picture of dispensationalism. But it became really, really popular with the Scofield Reference Bible, I think was a dispensational Bible. Dallas Theological Seminary, I think was one of the main seminaries that really, really had that theology and kind of spread it. And here I'm not even commenting on its truth or falsity, just real quickly mentioning the rough outline of what it is. I think we need to cover that more in depth. That's the background I come from. You probably come from. Most churches in America, I think most evangelical churches would be in the dispensational stream of one sort or another. And what he's saying, and Vishal Mangalwadi said this as well, like a lot of these guys that do hold to this more of all of Christ for all of life view, they tend to reject dispensationalism for various reasons. But they also, I think, rightfully note that dispensationalism, if you walk it out consistently, it does tend toward non-involvement with these issues because, as the analogy goes, why polish the brass on a sinking ship? If the Titanic's already hit, basically all you're trying to do is get as many people off as possible, get them in the lifeboats. And that's the situation they see the earth in. And so, if it would be a fool that would stand there and, clean the silver for the kitchen, right?
I
So that's why it does tend toward non-involvement. Now, having said that, some of the people that are most involved, like even Tim LaHaye, who wrote the Left Behind series, those are a fictional expression of dispensational theology. I think he and his wife are super involved in politics. So you do get a lot of people, thankfully, that they would say are inconsistent probably with their dispensationalism, but they would say thankfully so.
Gotcha.
It's very ironic that you have so many Protestants that are in this sort of let's limit everything to the centrality of the church, when they also are highly anti-Roman Catholic. But you see, historically, that's been the Roman Catholic view, that the church is the one great massive sacrament, and the goal is basically for everything to be brought into and sort of sanctified by the church. And the area outside the church, they would call all that is in the church, that's called grace, and everything outside is nature. That's the Thomistic distinction, the nature-grace distinction.
Yeah.
One book you've probably heard about, and I'm sure a number of your listeners have read or at least heard about, is the book by the neo-Orthodox writer Richard Niebuhr, Christ and Culture. He laid out an excellent taxonomy of different views historically of Christianity and culture. Much of modern evangelicalism would fall into what he calls Christ against culture. That is, the whole point, Jesus Christ came in order to take people away from culture, not to redeem culture, but to separate them from culture. Then there's the liberal paradigm, which none of us believes, Christ of culture. That is, all we do in the church is basically take what is going on in the culture and baptize it in the church, although sadly many evangelicals are doing that. But his final paradigm is the historic Reformed paradigm, Christ the transformer of culture. It doesn't see culture as normative, but it does see culture as a fit object for redemption on the basis of Christ's atoning work. So I think that evangelicals have simply bought into that paradigm for the longest time. And I think when your real nub of your question is great, where did it really come from? I think it goes back to something that we said earlier in the conversation, which is they really don't understand the fullness of the gospel. They define the gospel much more narrowly, in my view, than the Bible defines it. That, I think. There are other things, too. But the pietism flows into that. The dispensationalism flows into that. The ecclesiocentrism flows into that. All of these flow into a lack of understanding of what the gospel really is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And
what's interesting about that, too, is I don't think Sandlin would appreciate his view of what he's calling historic Reformed or historic, I can't remember how he termed it, but this view of Reformed Kuyperianism that he and others will claim, goes all the way back to, like they would say Paul taught it, and but he probably wouldn't like this Seven Mountains theology.
I was thinking about that
in total,
yeah.
but I do think there's a lot of overlap, and most of the guys. So the Seven Mountain theology is kind of growing, having an insurgency, typically in the more charismatic realms. Okay. So most of those guys are dispensationalists. But I think, they would hold to that narrow view of the gospel, but where they're seeing the need to broaden that out is the Great Commission, I think. Okay. And so they're saying, okay, no, the gospel is, heaven when they die, that has to do with sanctification as well, personal piety. But we also are called as a church to have an impact as salt and light. Seven Mountains is kind of like, how do you do that, right? So they said we've, like Lance Wallnau will say that we've focused on the church mountain for the past 150 years or whatever. And that's what he's called ecclesiocentrality or whatever, however he said it, this centering the church as the kingdom itself and nothing outside of that. Okay. That he said that dispensationalism and pietism have really combined to make us ineffective and keep us from impacting the culture around us like we should. Similarly, the Seven Mountains guys, although like I said, he wouldn't want his view to be put in the same view as that. But I think there's a lot of overlap. Okay. And I'm thankful for that, because I think the Seven Mountains starts with the same idea, like we should transform culture. And that is where they agree with the Reformed Kuyperians. And that's great. Theirs is just more of a how-to. Like the Seven Mountains is saying, you do that through impacting the business world, entertainment, education. And I think the Reform guys will say something similar. They just don't see it kind of in those prophetic terms like that. But if you wanted to transform a culture, those tend to be the spheres that do it. That's why the Marxists, they understood they wanted to transform culture. So they did it through propaganda in the media, in the universities, education. So the Seven Mountains is like a kind of a reverse of what they did from a Christian perspective, trying to retake the culture by taking back these mountains and influencing them. And I think that's interesting that you have a bunch of dispensationalists who are getting in the game based on that, based on a reframing of the understanding of what the mission of the church is to do. It's not just to build your church. And you'll hear Lance say that a lot. He's a big proponent of the Seven Mountains theology. And you'll hear him often saying that, right?
Right. He's the first I've heard teach on that.
Yeah.
And really broke it down. I was like, that's a brilliant plan.
Yeah. And so Bill Bright, I think for Campus Crusade, and also used to teach something similar. The Q Commons had the seven spheres, even though they weren't really in the charismatic realm. But I think he's right to say that, like, just focusing on your church growth and your church plan, it's too myopic. It's ecclesiocentric. And he's saying the Catholics were like that. Roman Catholic theology was more like that. So he thought it was ironic that the Protestants had bought into that same idea for so long. But I appreciate the fact that whatever side you're coming from on this, that you're getting involved, because I think it is ultimately more biblical, however you frame it and however you do it exactly. Sandlin's rooting it back to the gospel. The Seven Mountain people rooting it back to probably the mission of the church. But either way, we're getting back to that full expression of fulfilling the creational mandate and the Great Commission.
I think too, a lot of the level of argument is actually in the church. This kind of ties into pietism too. A lot of the argument is kind of shallow. So I've had this conversation with people and I say, we need to be thinking about transforming the culture. We're in a culture war, whether or not you want to be in one, we're in one. But a lot of times people will say, hey man, just keep it centered on the gospel. And that's kind of where, for most people, the conversation ends. But one of the trends that's interesting in pietism and in feminism is they can both tend to be anti-doctrinal. And I'm curious why you think maybe that is.
Yes, well, that's been, if you think about it for a minute.
If you want to grow in your confidence in knowing what you believe and why you believe it, if you want to ground your faith in biblical Christianity and step into who God has called you to be, I want to tell you about a great program put on by Impact 360, and it's called Propel. Propel is a 1-week transformational leadership and discipleship experience where high school students gather together to be grounded in a biblical worldview as they learn how to follow Jesus, have a godly influence, learn how to disciple their peers, and boldly live out their faith in their daily lives. So they're having 2 sessions this summer. The first one is June 19th through the 25th, and the second one is June 26th through July 2nd. These programs fill up really quickly, and I promise you will not be disappointed. So we'll put the link below if you're interested in looking into it, and we'll see you this summer.
So have you experienced that at all? If so, how did you see that take place in life?
I sense more of a pushback on more getting involved in culture and taking the mountains. But I do periodically get a sprinkle of a pushback on like thinking critically or thinking, diving deeper into doctrine and knowing what you believe and why. It's just about worship right now. I feel like just gathering together to sing for hours and hours in worship, which is beautiful, but I don't see often, let's get together and dig into the scriptures and really exegete and just see what the book of Romans or anything like that. So maybe I'm being too judgmental, but I'm sure it's going on, but I don't see a definite pushback, but I can't say that I am.
That it's been a major thing that you've noticed.
Yeah.
I think.
How about you?
Yeah, it has for me because of my interaction with the faith. I was always bothered by certain questions.
Oh yeah, of course.
So I bring my questions to the church, and it was kind of like
you had questions, Joe. Lots of questions.
Lots of questions. Lots of struggles with the intellectual side of the faith, and it was really, really far and few between where I could find someone that had even thought about, basic stuff like why should I trust the Bible? How do I know it's authoritative, inerrant? Just basic, kind of questions like that. And so it took me a long time to find. There were historically there were thousands of Christians who have thought through that stuff at a way deeper level than I ever will. And there, even currently, there's pockets of it, but by and large, growing up in the background I did, there was a high emphasis on spiritually experiencing God.
Okay.
Knowing Him is great. Like, there was authentic Christianity. It was sincere, but it definitely anti-intellectual. But I was surprised when I started doing a lot of ministry outside of my circle in different denominations, the Baptist world and other worlds. I was surprised to still see a lot of that come through, and especially a lack of engagement with the questions that the culture was having around. And I thought, why is that? And this kind of explains that why pietism itself lends toward anti-intellectualism.
It's interesting. Now that you mention it, I remember attending a church in Nashville, Bethel Word Outreach, and at the time, Pastor Rice Brooks was the first pastor to ever teach sort of apologetically.
Yeah.
But he was really involved in culture. He was the brains behind the God's Not Dead movies. And so he definitely was not of pietism, but yet he really encouraged us to really think through the faith. And he would give these messages, and I was like, wow, what kind of preaching is that? Because that was new to me at the time. But then at the same time, he's traveling the world, really engaging culture.
Yeah, he was going to college campuses. You go to one college campus and have an open forum, you'll be encouraged to do your studying.
For sure.
But doctrine, I think, is a subset of intellectual pursuit, like biblical doctrine.
Okay.
It's interesting that there's a move for that too. There's a real hesitancy to get too much into doctrine in evangelical churches. And I remember once there was a massive church in Texas. I won't name it in this particular podcast because it's not that important, but they were doing this thing called Freedom Ministry.
Okay.
And part of the Freedom Ministry, they had this tree that they were putting it in the category where you're thinking according to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so, in other words, if you wanted to walk in the freedom that God had, you needed to stop walking according to this tree that we were, had the fallen state. One of the branches on that tree just plainly said doctrine.
Ooh.
And I know they didn't mean that to the fullest, because I know the people involved, but that the fact that could make it through the printing press and make it to all these churches that they were spreading it to, I was like, yikes, because it did lend toward that. They would have these exercises where they would, kind of have you bracket everything you believed about God and just let the Holy Spirit tell you who God is. And
wow.
I was like, man, that's a dangerous recipe right there. But I noticed how that just kind of was easily accepted, I think, by the churches I knew of that were adopting that freedom ministry thing. And there was some good stuff in it for sure. And I understand what they meant, because I think what they were trying to get away from was the kind of scholasticism that drives you away from God and that makes you just this kind of anxious, angry person. But the way it was stated was still, it was very much in the wrong direction. But anyways, we'll hear what Sandlin has to say about it.
Of course, the gospel presupposes doctrine. But for them, if the important thing is this vertical relationship with God and sort of a warm heart devotion, the emphasis on doctrine inherently creates a call to follow, to believe or disbelieve, and therefore a division.
Yeah.
So because they often don't want division, they don't want doctrine. I've often heard.
That's an interesting point too, right? Because when you do get into, you've had classes too, where when I was doing Biola, the science of religion, you have your debate boards, and, the more precise you try to get with doctrine, it does, it kind of splits people into camps, and you can understand that pietistic tendency to reject that because you don't want to have those divisions in your church, right?
Right. But some of the consequences of not having those kinds of understandings is that culture right now is trying to answer every question and bombarding young people and adults with answers to those deep questions. Who is man? who is God? What kind of world do we live in? And it's like either we find the answers biblically, or we'll just adopt the world's answers. And so that's the hard thing about
And that's what happens in a lot of these churches. And we're just saying we can understand that impulse. It's the wrong impulse. Yeah. But we can understand it. Yeah. And the reason it's the wrong impulse is exactly what you said, because we are made to have a worldview, and you're going to fill in that worldview, that belief system, with and most of us are indoctrinated in public schools that are set against the knowledge of God. Right. So if you're not correcting that through biblical doctrine, sound doctrine, then that's going to be their disposition, and you're just going to paste like some kind of fluffy, ambiguous Jesus words over it, trying to get people to have experiences in warm fellowship with God.
Yeah, even today we heard a great teaching in church about marriage, and finally just a good biblical foundational understanding of marriage. Yeah. And so look out in our culture, they're trying to redefine it. They're trying to just anything goes under the context of marriage, and it's just not true. Yeah, no, you're right. And it's crazy that a basic message on marriage is like, it's revolutionary now. But it is, man. It stands out. It's amazing. And, but so you do have to find that place of wisdom and knowing. That's why he says not being too quick to disagree strongly on those secondary issues in a way that cuts people and demeans them. Like, you have to know how to fight in a good biblical way about doctrine, but you have to go through that. You can't avoid those discussions. You just have to be. And then also, like, unity is held in our culture is the only thing. Love and unity, right? These are held up as like the highest virtue to the neglect of anything else. You can't build unity without truth. Come on. So there are times when you actually need to divide over some issues. And then within that, you have to learn how to create unity in the proper way while still upholding truth, and maybe even learning how to disagree on certain issues, and other things we have to come into uniformity. So
people say doctrine divides, but Christ unites. Well, that's a false antithesis. It is true that Christ unites, but even to talk about Christ is to invoke doctrine. Which Christ? Is Christ God and man? In what sense is he God and man? What is his calling? Did he die? Did he rise? So all of this is the case. So a de-emphasis on doctrine, and this, by the way, was also a problem with Spainer's pietism, and historically with pietism. This is why historically pietism led to Protestant liberalism. Probably the first Protestant liberal most people acknowledge.
Now wow. That was a new thought for me when I heard that. Okay. But you can see why. Because and I think that's why, honestly, a lot of the evangelical churches were easily taken in by CRT. And then once you're taken in by CRT, that's the road to progressive Christianity, liberalism, as he called it. Like, progressive Christianity in modern form is, like, to me, a less intellectually rigorous form of old, like, modern liberalism. That was much more thoughtful, but they're on the same place in a lot of areas. But why is it that pietism tends to lead toward that? Because when you get rid of that emphasis on doctrine, it opens you up to anything, right? Yeah. And then if you're a feelings, like if it's based on emotion and feeling, all of a sudden they can come in and trick you by taking up for the oppressed. Yeah. And you're just taken right in by it because you don't have the precision of thought to discern and see through that. Yeah. And CRT came with such a wave of virtue and compassion, false compassion, or just a way to really feel like you're doing something. Yep. You're fighting a cause. You are on the right side of things. It came like a flood, and we stood by and it appealed to all those soft virtues: unity, love, tolerance. So again, if you're not like really, really chopping that stuff up, it's going to pull you right in. And I think that's the connection. Mm-hmm. The first Protestant liberal Friedrich Schleiermacher came from a very pietistic family. Yeah. And he eventually said that the Christian theology and the Christian faith is not about what the Bible teaches, but about what the church feels about what the Bible teaches. Well, if you don't believe that the Bible is propositional revelation and gives to us doctrine, and everything then is reduced to this sort of notion of dependence, he said, dependence on God, that's not bounded by certain truths,
well, then eventually you can believe anything about Jesus Christ. You don't have to believe he's the Son of God. You don't have to believe in salvation by grace. So,
and it's a lot easier to believe along the lines of the culture around you than it is to buck against.
It's a more peaceful day, isn't
it? Man, you know?
Yeah. It's lonely. It can be scary at times, but it's you're right. It doesn't make for, you don't always gain friends and influence people.
Listen.
Pietism is the grandfather of Protestant liberalism. It didn't intend to be.
Interesting.
But when you get rid of doctrine, you eventually will buy into what we understand to be liberalism.
Yeah, and there's an interesting connection, I think, too, with the church today. Maybe this is all the pietism is maybe one of the reasons why the church has been so susceptible to critical race theory, to Marxism. I wonder if you think that's true or why. I mean, I've asked that question because, 15 years ago, I was reading Mark Dever and C.J. Mahaney and John Piper, and I didn't have any inclination at the time that was going to go woke and socialist. But it has gone down that hill pretty fast. Again, I just want to ask you if you see that, and do you think that the pietism opened the door for a lot of those things?
Yeah, you've actually put your finger on it. So here's what's happened. They have this sort of escapism has suffered revenge. And here's what happened. Because at the time they wanted to limit the faith to these issues of warm personal piety and a church that follows Christ and personal sanctification, and not address and not recognize the importance of a comprehensive worldview. Because of that, thinking that they could protect themselves just by that devotion, we have found them to be sadly wrong. This is a good example. My friend Joe Boot points out so many pastors, it's interesting, they'll say, we're going to keep politics out of this church. We're not going to politicize it. We're not going to preach about politics. We're going to protect this church from any political ideas. Well, they never do that, because if the church doesn't get its political ideas from the Word of God on the pulpit, the church will get it from the wider culture.
That's basically what he just said. Earlier he said the focus became not what the Bible said, but what the church felt about what the Bible said. And I just wonder that's such a trick of the enemy to get feelings first on the throne, to be the filter for everything. How do we feel about this? As opposed to what has God spoken about this? I think therein lies the battle. What will you do once you hear the truth? Will you receive it, or will you focus on your feelings about it? And at the end of the day, you'll have to decide. But not deciding towards Bible is right. It's a decision, and you're not saved from that that kind of decision. And that enemy, he's a trickster.
Yep, that's good, babe.
You never protect the church from politics by refusing to address politics in the church. I think analogously, that's what's happened with many of these other ministries. They were blindsided by all this stuff because they didn't stress the necessity of a robust Christian worldview that would have protected them from it. They only had very small walls. They didn't have the high walls, the godly walls of a worldview. They had very short walls of sort of personal piety.
That's a good analogy, right? Little short walls around your city. People just hop over it.
That's amazing.
Instead of them tall walls with the jokers up there with the arrows,
that's walls of good doctrine. That's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
That's really
but that won't protect you against alien worldview.
Yeah, that's so huge. I think the other thing, Andrew, is the one of the things inherent in all of this is a sort of antinomian bent.
So we talked a little bit about that word. So nomian, nomos, law. So when you see, antinomian is, basically the modern version of Christianity. Hopefully they'll explain. I can't remember everything that they say, but where we have a low regard for any laws of God or anything like that. And so we tend to be, just free to do whatever, and also, so the word, we talked about theonomy. Theos, God, and nomi, law, God's law, and that particular view. But
So early in my days, like this is mid 2000s, I remember actually writing John Piper, and his son Abraham, I think, responded to me. But okay, so at the point, I'm like a Fundy Baptist. I'm going to Southern Seminary. And my question is, I'm looking at the Old Testament and I said, well, how do you understand the law of God to the New Testament? And that's not from reading anything. This is like pre-Rushdoony. It's pre any of that.
Rushdoony is one of the guys too that's probably influential in a lot of the Reformed Kuyperians. Okay. R.J. Rushdoony, he wrote a lot, like kind of Francis Schaeffer type stuff, was involved in trying to bring about like this movement. And I thought autonomy as well, self-law.
Okay, yeah.
So and like Douglas Wilson and others will say, when it ultimately, it's either going to be theonomy or autonomy. Like
gotcha.
When you get down to like brass tacks, like it's either going to be God's law or my own law, or the law we constructed together. But those are the only real two categories.
But I sense that there was a whole generation of people saying, well, we have all this content in the Old Testament and nobody knows what to do with it. And so the answer was, well, just be gospel-centered and believe the gospel. And that really, as you pointed out, was a recipe for disaster. So I guess my question with all of that is, you would see antinomianism written in all of this.
Yeah, I think pietism leads to that. There's a strong division between the testaments. And because the law of God makes demands on our lives, and because they often misread the New Testament, when Paul criticizes the law, he always criticizes it in the context of a means of justification.
Right.
He never criticizes the law as a description of God's holy character and as a standard for our sanctification. No self-respecting Christian in the New Testament era would ever have thought otherwise. They didn't have a New Testament. People don't think about that. I've heard people say, well, we want to establish a New Testament church, or we want to get back to New Testament Christianity. I say, have you ever thought of the fact that people actually living in the era covered by the New Testament never could have thought that way?
Right.
This is why Paul again and again has to justify his statements about Christ and about the law and about the gospel by quoting the Old Testament. That's true of the others also.
So there's, what he's talking about there is true too. And you see this in evangelicalism, like just wanting to kind of get rid of or ignore the Old Testament,
Yeah. I've heard of pastors who are no longer going to teach from.
Yeah, man. And, and Andy Stanley famously said that a couple of years ago about unhooking the Old Testament. And he meant that in a specific context. But even when he explained like what he meant by that, I think it still was very telling, and it did go along these lines that basically, we're at best, we're a little bit embarrassed by it and we want to move it to the side when we're trying to reach people. And then I think his idea was, well, you could bring it back in later as they mature. But I don't have a high level of confidence that North Point, I think it's North Point, is actually doing that. And then I think the fruit of that, how he's responded to all these things, is in line with what these guys are saying about not having that proper view of the Old Testament.
Thing that's really ironic about this, Eric, is this is not a new idea. The Puritans themselves had a very high view of the law. And a lot of the people that you mentioned, they're not unintelligent. They know what the Puritans said, but if you ask them privately, and occasionally they'll let this slip, they disagree with the Puritans on that. The problem with the Puritans is they had a very high view of the law, and we know that's not correct. Well, no, they don't know that that's not correct. The Puritans were right because they had a full view of biblical authority. Antinomianism, of course, is anti-law, and modern evangelicalism is shot through with that.
Yeah.
For another reason, and I think at a more basic level, we have to acknowledge, is part of this is that the law of God will put a crimp on their personal autonomy. It's easy for them to say, well, the Holy Spirit led me, or I felt like this today. In my quiet time today, Jesus told me.
Yeah.
And if you say, well, look what the law of God says, well, I'm not governed by that. I'm governed by what Jesus told me today in my quiet time. That's just an excuse for an exercise of personal autonomy, which is the base form of worldliness. That's what our culture's saying. And so they just put like a nice little spiritual or Christian veneer on it.
Yeah, it's really interesting, too, because I think you mentioned how some of these guys, Piper's a good example. I was reading Piper, listening to Piper sermons, and in many ways, he was kind of like a gateway drug because he was talking about John Owen. He was talking about Jonathan Edwards. So I went back and read these guys. And it's funny because you would read them, you'd read Calvin, and you'd go, wait a minute, these guys are, a lot of them are Presbyterians, they're Duncan babies. And some of the newer guys were just kind of picking and choosing the parts that they wanted to take. But I think for myself, and I know a lot of other people as well, if you start reading those original sources, you start getting opened up to things like, I quickly then after that got involved with reading like Greg Bahnsen, again, Rushdoony, Institutes of Law, stuff like that. And you're going, wait a minute, these guys have thought through this. And this is really amazing. So I wonder if you see, and this is kind of what I've thought is interesting, but I wonder if you see it, a lot of young people who I didn't really expect. So I'm a millennial, but there are people who follow this podcast, Baptists included, who are coming to me and saying, I just read Rushdoony and I think I'm post-mill and I might even become a Presbyterian. What's happening? Curious if you've seen that, just kind of an awakening of some sort with younger people on these issues.
Yeah. There are a number of reasons for that, of course, and not one. But I'll tell you one of those, and that is I think a lot of those, like you, Eric, they see the rise of critical race theory, the rise of cultural Marxism.
Yeah.
These onerous statist COVID lockdown orders. And I think they look at this pietism of the Gospel Coalition, John Piper, and they understand while they may have personal affection for these individuals, those ministries and people don't offer the resources. They don't offer the theological and conceptual resources for addressing these issues. But
I think that became apparent over that year for me, just because same thing, like I had affection for a lot of these guys, had read their stuff and appreciated it. And still, not to throw it away, like there's still great stuff and, brothers in Christ, but they theologically didn't give the resources for how to deal with what's going on and how to actually prepare and run it in the other direction. So I think it just alerted people, so a lot of young people too, like, hey, if this theology can't address this part of life, maybe it's not the whole story. And then when you begin to look back at the Bible and Christian history, you're like, oh, yeah, there are resources for this.
Look around at some of these other guys and ministries and that historic Reformed and Puritan vision, and they can say, this is where I can get some resources for addressing these evils of today. I think that's one thing that's driving this movement of a lot of millennials toward a more robust worldviewish faith.
Yeah, that's absolutely huge. I know for me, when I was in college, I was a philosophy major, and we're reading Hume and all this, pagan philosophy and some interesting stuff. And I would go to church and I would say, who here knows how to refute David Hume? And people, or Immanuel Kant, were reading his book on reason. And what do you do with this as a Christian? And people were like, well, I mean, you pray the sinner's prayer and then you accept Jesus in your heart. And that's all I know. So, and that really wasn't enough. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. When you find guys who could actually respond to this, who actually had ammunition and they had guns that were bigger than the pagans, it was kind of like, that is actually a big turn on.
It's interesting that there's a parallel between getting involved in the culture and politics and getting involved in the intellectual battles. Because we say this all the time, that the primary way that Satan works is through ideas and images. And so, one of the ways we do spiritual warfare is taking all those thoughts captive. And we don't do that by shouting at them. We do that by, understanding where they fall short and pointing out the errors in that way of thinking. And so, oftentimes, like in the pietistic movement, what will accompany sort of a political passivism will be an intellectual passivism, where they just don't want to. And so you'll be, if you try to get answers to that kind of thing in those churches, by and large, it'll be hard to find. Now, Tim Keller might be an exception to that, because he's actually, I don't think he fits the pietist category so much. I think he's more of a Kuyperian thinker, but on the wrong end. So his problem, I think, is with his definition of justice. And but he wants to apply biblical worldview. I think he just gets some keys wrong there. But on the pietist side, that does tend to be the intellectual passivism does tend to be the rule.
And it's a good resource.
Well, yeah, I think one thing you're implying there, this is another problem that often parallels pietism, and that is anti-intellectualism.
Yes.
It's often modern Christians don't feel like it's necessary to address Kantian transcendentalism or Hume skepticism or Nietzsche's postmodernism or so on, not recognizing that if Christians don't properly address and refute them, that these ideas will just sort of float around and people will accept them because nobody's refuting them.
Yeah.
The fact that we don't refute them doesn't mean that they're not dangerous.
Yeah, that's correct.
And that's why we need people that do have those resources. But and this is a bottom line issue, the people.
Yeah, need people that have those resources. So we did our young adult ministry back in the Dizzy. One of the things I took as my starting point for like the first 2 years really was J.P. Moreland's book, The Kingdom Triangle. And, he talked about this historian, Michael Green, who did probably the largest study on how was the early church able to flourish in a culture and a political system set against it. And he narrowed it down to 3 things. And it was basically the recovery of the Christian mind, the renovation of the heart, and the restoration of the Spirit's power. And what he meant by that was, with the mind, they could outthink their opponents. They did great. They understood theology. They did apologetics. They could outthink them and engage with them on that level. See that kind of wisdom in Stephen, before he's stoned. But you have that in early apologists, Justin Martyr, others. But too, the heart and the love in the community that spilled out beyond it, real biblical love too, not the kind of the modern gushy version. And then 3, the power of the Spirit working through them, through, in that case, signs, miracles, and different things like that.
That's good stuff.
I think, being engaged, we were trying to teach that from a biblical perspective in each area and understand, like, not everybody has to be a scholar on Hume or Kant, but they need to know where the resources are for that within the church. We all have our stations. It's kind of like an army, right? Mm-hmm. Or Army, Navy, like all these branches of the Christian world where you can, you do your part, you guard your post, but you can appeal to others and get help from others.
Yeah. Good.
People that have the resources are people that recognize that the Word of God must speak in the totality of life, in the totality of all of our experience. And that's not pietism. Therefore, you won't get the resources among pietists to address what's going on in our world today.
Yeah, absolutely huge. One of the questions I want to ask, and this is a little bit more about critical race theory.
Well, I'm going to pop off here because,
Sure.
we'll cover that. We have covered that and cover that more in depth with other episodes. But any last thoughts on just kind of what we're learning about pietism and these streams?
Yeah, just recapping that in and of itself, it's not awful or evil. It's just what it leaves out, just making the gospel thin and not making it the robust narrative of the Bible. And so just being aware of that God saves us and brings us to spheres of influence, to have impact, to be salt, to make waves.
Yeah.
He wouldn't give us his Spirit just for personal, private reasons. Yes, for that, but not solely.
Yeah.
We serve a big God who is with us, who wants to renew our minds, who wants to empower us and to use us in mighty ways in culture. So
yeah, man.
That's my encouragement to you out there. And even I remember having a pastor that said, even if you want to reach the world, be good at what you do. Wherever you are, do it with excellence. Do it with the skill set with excellence, like unto the Lord.
Yeah.
And even starting there, and then just really studying the scriptures, getting a really good understanding of the Bible. Is huge in this day and age. It's like it's against the flow. And it's you stand out but you never know who is God is prepared for you to reach and to really influence and save from this depraved culture that we live in. And so I'm gonna stay encouraged. I'm gonna keep on just praying for that early apostle kind of power God would infuse us and continue to use us in ways that's beyond us.
Yeah, man, that's good. Well, hopefully this has been a good primer on pietism. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Email us, comment on something. Like I said, we're still in this journey of learning what it is and how it has impacted our present. Stuff. Parts of it that, hey, these parts are biblical and good, and other parts that we need to bring some correctives on, and hopefully we laid out a good start for you there. So, hit us up, and we'll talk to you or see you soon.
Blessings.